situation. The same thing applies to getting oil out of the bitumen and the tar sands in Argentina and in Canada. They require gigantic investments of natural gas to blast the sort of sandy, oily rock and separate the oily substances from the sort of basement rock. And unfortunately, not only is oil in decline, but also gas supplies are in decline. They've been in decline since about 1984. So, you know, I really think that there's very, very little hope of us finding any significant amounts of oil. They're running out.
And new ways of extracting it, new ways of processing it, new ways of using it so we get more from what we do use. Do any of those offer any cause for optimism?
No. I mean, the Burgan oil field in Kuwait is already in decline. It used to be able to produce oil at more than 2 million barrels a day. It's now down to 1.7. The Garwa oil field in Saudi Arabia, it's a state secret as to how much oil they've got, but they've consistently been unable to increase oil production to meet or increase in oil demands, and in fact they're now down to 4 million barrels a day. They were over 5.5 million barrels a day at peak. All the big oil fields are in serious decline, so we're having to dig deeper and getting more and more difficult oil. We've already picked the low-lying fruit. We've already had the oil that's easy to get. What oil we get now is going to become increasingly difficult to extract, and ultimately we're going to reach the stage where it actually costs more energy to extract that oil than we get from it. And that will be the point at which it's just not going to be a viable proposition to produce oil at any price.
And yet so much of modern living is dependent on oil in ways that people don't even recognise how much oil we use. For instance, I mean, food production is oil dependent, isn't it, at the moment?
Absolutely. People say jocularly that we actually eat oil. What they mean is that 99% of food production depends on oil in some way, from the tractors that work the soil to the tractors that drive the engines that harvest the food that we make, to the storage of the food in storage facilities, to the transport of food, to the processing of food. We also use natural gas to make fertilizer. We also use oil to make insecticides and pesticides. And in fact, it's very reasonable to assume that as oil production declines, so will global food production. And I personally find this extremely frightening prospect. When we started exploiting coal, the human population was approximately 1 billion people. 100 years later, we started exploiting oil, and at that time the human population was 1.5 billion people. Now, since that time, the human population has increased by 4 times to 6.5 billion, but its total economy, which in a sense is the cost the cost to the environment that we're causing, has increased by a factor of 60 times. So what will happen, it is possible to argue that the carrying capacity of the Earth might only be 1 billion people. Now, it may not be quite as bad as that, and for example, Cuba, which in 1989 went through its special period, its so-called special period when it lost the patronage of the Soviet Union and therefore could no longer afford to buy massive amounts of oil and fertilizer to continue cash cropping agriculture. Cuba was able to transform its agriculture into one which was based around home gardening and patio gardening and local markets. And Cuba actually got through that period with surprisingly well. I mean, the Cuban life expectancy is still about the same as it is in New Zealand and the United States. It still has a relatively low fertility rate, and Cuban society has coped with that transition quite well. And I think that many countries around the world just will not be able to. I mean, you can spare a thought for the people in Arabia, for example. Before we started exploiting the oil in Saudi Arabia, there were only a few thousand people living a nomadic lifestyle in the desert. Now there are literally millions of them. When the oil runs out, they can't eat sand, so either they move away or they starve to death. And that might actually be something that's happening on a global scale.
So what, you get kind of food refugees, if you like?
Well, there are already refugees. There are refugees from famine. There are refugees from water depletion all around the world, especially in places like China and Iran, and in that Central Asian area. There are refugees from war and famine. Famine, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, has become a way of life. There's a problem of desertification, which means the conversion of land from marginal land to frank desert, which is happening all over the world, especially north and south of the Sahara Desert into the Horn of Africa. In southern Africa, Zimbabwe would be in serious trouble even if they didn't have Robert Mugabe. There's desertification happening in China, in Pakistan, Iran. There's a huge, and Brazil, northeastern Brazil, Central America and South America. All of these parts of the world are seeing advancements of deserts all over the world, and as a consequence we're seeing thousands and thousands of refugees.
If you listen to organisations like the World Bank, though, and if you attend meetings of the WTO or the G8, the focus of those groups is to lift the standard of living of the people in the places you've just talked about. And their recipe for lifting the standard of living in those places is economic growth. It is that they adapt more to lifestyles like ours. They trade, they manufacture, they grow on a grand scale, these kinds of things. These are all things which might lift the standard of living of individuals, but they will all have a huge environmental cost, won't they?
Well, economic growth has been the panacea for all of our human problems. It has been the universally accepted panacea for about 50 years or more. But the reality is that economic growth cannot physically continue forever when the Earth is actually a finite size. For example, China's economy is growing at 8% per year. If that continues for another generation, China's gross national product will actually be equal to that of the United States by about 2025. And at that time, China would be consuming 1.5 times the wood that the world is producing. It would be producing 70% of all of the food that the world is producing. It would be using more of the oil than the world is currently able to produce. I think it's something over 90 million barrels per day. So you can see that actually growth isn't possible if the Earth isn't growing. Growth can only happen at the expense of your competitors, or if you just let some sort of exponential positive feedback process, such as population growth, continue unabated, eventually it is absolutely inevitable that you reach limits to growth. I mean, if you look at, for example, the fecundity of rabbits, I don't remember how many generations it is, but if you just let them breed at their maximum potential capacity for a few generations, they would actually cover the Earth to something like a kilometre thick. I mean, it is just physically not possible to continually grow without reaching limits to growth, and that is what we are seeing around the world at the moment.
Yeah, but you will have heard the political debate about these sorts of issues. I mean, for instance, in New Zealand, here's an interesting statistic from your speech, and that is that last year in New Zealand we covered an extra 37,000 hectares with houses. So 37,000 hectares of New Zealand that was farmland or forest or grass, whatever, wetlands, was covered with houses just last year alone. Now, the politicians would say that that was a terrific thing, because that is one of the reasons why we've got historically low levels of unemployment. That is one of the reasons why we've had growth faster than Australia in the past year. It's one of the reasons why there's a sense of well-being in a lot of New Zealand at the moment.
But this is